Henrik Voss knelt on the wooden floor of his Montana cabin while a blizzard howled outside at -23 degrees, and the surface beneath his hand registered a steady 58 degrees without a fire burning for 6 hours. 300 yards away, his neighbor, Lars Pedersen, huddled against his stone fireplace on a dirt floor so cold it had frozen his water bucket solid, unable to understand how Henrik's cabin defied every law of frontier survival he knew. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The pain woke Henrik Voss before dawn on January 12, 1841. His feet burned with a cold so intense it felt like fire. He sat up in his bunk and pulled off the 2 pairs of wool socks he had worn to bed. Even in the darkness, he could see his toes were white. Not pale, white, the color of birch bark. He touched them and felt nothing. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. The fire had died sometime after midnight. Henrik always let it die. Firewood was labor, and he needed to conserve both wood and energy for the work that defined frontier survival. Most nights the cabin cooled to near freezing by morning. That was normal. That was acceptable. But this morning was different. Henrik stood and immediately sat back down. The dirt floor beneath his feet was so cold it sent a shock through his legs. He had built this cabin the previous spring using standard methods: log walls, notched corners, mud chinking, and a packed dirt floor. The floor was typical of frontier construction. Dirt was free. It was level enough. It was what everyone used. But standing barefoot on it in January was like standing on creek ice. Henrik pulled his socks back on and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. He rebuilt the fire, coaxing the embers into flame and adding kindling until he had enough heat to add larger pieces of split pine. The fire grew. Warmth began radiating into the small space. But the dirt floor remained frozen. It would stay frozen until spring. Henrik examined his feet in the growing firelight. 3 toes on his left foot showed the unmistakable signs of frostbite. The tissue was hard. The color was wrong. He had seen this before on other men. Sometimes the tissue recovered. Sometimes it blackened and fell off. He spent that morning keeping the fire high, and soaking his feet in water he heated pot by pot. The toes began to regain color. The pain intensified as circulation returned. That was a good sign. Pain meant the tissue was alive. By midday, Henrik could move all his toes. The danger had passed. But something had changed in his thinking. He had spent 9 winters on the frontier. He had survived temperatures far colder than last night. He had endured blizzards that lasted days. He had always considered himself competent at winter survival. But this morning had revealed a problem he had not fully understood. The floor was killing him slowly, not quickly like a bear attack or a fall through ice. Slowly. Night after night, the frozen ground beneath his cabin pulled heat from his body. Even with fire, even with blankets, even with double socks, the cold came up through the dirt and took its toll. Henrik looked at the floor with new attention. It was not just dirt. It was the weak point in his entire shelter system. Henrik's feet healed over the next 3 weeks, but the frostbite left permanent damage. 2 toes on his left foot lost sensation at the tips. They functioned normally, but he could not feel texture or temperature through them. The numbness was a constant reminder of how close he had come to losing them entirely. Other settlers in the territory had not been as fortunate. Henrik learned this when he traveled to the trading post at Benson Creek in early February. The post served trappers and settlers scattered across a 100 square miles of Montana wilderness. It was the only regular meeting point for men who otherwise lived in complete isolation. At the post, Henrik met a trapper named Samuel Marsh who was missing 3 toes on his right foot. Lost them 2 winters prior to frostbite that turned gangrenous. The local doctor, such as he was, had amputated with a heated knife and whiskey for anesthesia. Samuel walked with a permanent limp. He could still trap, but the injury had reduced his range and mobility. Another man, a homesteader named Robert Chen, had lost all 5 toes on his left foot the previous winter. Robert had waited too long to seek help. By the time he reached someone with medical knowledge, the blackened tissue extended past the toes into his foot. The amputation was more extensive. Robert could barely walk now. His homesteading days were effectively over. The trading post keeper, a man named Dutch Henry, who had operated the post for 12 years, told Henrik that foot injuries were the most common serious ailment he saw. Not bear attacks, not gunshot wounds, not knife fights, frozen feet. Men spent their winters in poorly heated cabins with frozen floors. They wore inadequate footwear. They let fires die at night to conserve wood. The cold came up through the ground and destroyed tissue inch by inch, night by night. Most men survived with minor damage like Henrik's numb toes. Some lost digits, a few lost feet, and every few years someone died from infection after an amputation went bad. Dutch Henry showed Henrik a shelf behind his counter that held 11 boots and shoes, all left behind by men who no longer needed them. Some boots had the toes cut out to accommodate bandaged stumps. Others were simply abandoned after their owners died or left the territory. It was a grim collection. Henrik bought supplies and rode back to his cabin, thinking about those boots. He thought about Samuel's limp and Robert's ruined homestead. He thought about his own numb toes, and how easily he could have joined that collection of damaged men. The frontier killed people in obvious ways: grizzly bears, harsh weather, accidents with axes or guns. But it also killed people slowly through accumulated small injuries. A man could survive a decade in the mountains and still be destroyed by something as simple as a cold floor. Henrik had always focused on the dramatic threats. Build strong walls against bears, keep enough firewood for blizzards, maintain your rifle and your skills. But he had ignored the floor beneath his feet, and it had nearly crippled him. That would not happen again. Henrik returned to his cabin and looked at the dirt floor with the intensity of a man studying an enemy. For 9 winters, he had accepted this floor as inevitable. Dirt was what you walked on. It was free, abundant, and required no special skill to install. Every cabin he had ever seen used dirt floors. Some men laid flat stones if suitable rocks were available nearby. A few wealthy settlers had wooden floors, but lumber was expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Dirt was the universal solution. But universal did not mean good. Henrik began paying attention to temperature in a way he never had before. He noticed that even with a roaring fire heating the cabin to comfortable levels, the floor remained cold. He could feel the difference when he walked barefoot from the area near the fireplace to the area near the door. Near the fire, the dirt was tolerable. 10 feet away, it was frigid. The dirt itself was not insulating. It was conducting cold from the frozen ground below directly into the cabin. The floor was essentially a giant cold sink, pulling heat downward. He started visiting other structures in the area, studying how different buildings handled the ground interface. He rode to a root cellar built by a homesteader named Anders Olofsson. The cellar was dug 8 feet into the earth with a wooden roof covered in sod. Henrik climbed down into it and immediately noticed something remarkable. The temperature was cool but stable. Outside, the February air was well below freezing. Inside the root cellar, the temperature felt like a mild autumn day, maybe 45 or 50 degrees. The vegetables stored in baskets and barrels were not frozen. Some potatoes had even sprouted. Anders explained that root cellars worked because deep earth stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. Dig down far enough and you reached a zone where temperature barely changed regardless of surface conditions. In Montana, that zone started about 4 feet down. Below that depth, the earth maintained a relatively constant temperature year-round, somewhere around 50 to 55 degrees. It was why root cellars protected vegetables and why spring houses kept milk cold in summer. The Earth itself was a temperature regulator. Henrik asked if Anders ever noticed temperature differences in his cabin. Anders said his cabin was no different than anyone else's. Cold floor in winter, dusty floor in summer. Henrik asked if Anders had ever considered building his cabin floor like a root cellar, using the Earth's stable temperature instead of fighting it. Anders looked at him like he was crazy. You did not dig down in a cabin, you built up. That was how construction worked. Henrik thanked him and rode home, but the idea would not leave his mind. What if you did dig down? What if you built a floor that accessed the Earth's stable temperature instead of suffering the surface's extremes? Henrik spent March experimenting with small test pits around his property. He dug holes at various depths and left them open for weeks, checking them daily with a simple thermometer he had purchased from Dutch Henry's trading post. The thermometer was crude, a glass tube with mercury that gave approximate readings, but it was sufficient for Henrik's purpose. He wanted to understand how temperature changed with depth. The results fascinated him. At ground surface, temperature fluctuated wildly. A sunny March afternoon might warm the top inch of soil to 40 degrees. That same night, it would drop to 20 or below. 6 inches down, the fluctuations were less extreme, but still significant. Temperature at that depth changed by 10 to 15 degrees between day and night. At 12 inches deep, the changes became smaller. Day to night variations were only 5 or 6 degrees. At 24 inches, the temperature barely moved. It stayed between 42 and 46 degrees, regardless of what was happening at the surface. At 48 inches, 4 feet down, the temperature locked into a narrow range between 51 and 54 degrees. That stability amazed Henrik. Outside, the weather could swing from sunny and calm to blizzard conditions. The surface could freeze and thaw. But 4 feet down, the Earth remembered nothing of these changes. It maintained its own temperature independent of the chaos above. Henrik understood he was observing something fundamental about how Earth stores and releases heat. The ground was not just dirt. It was thermal mass. During summer, the sun heated the surface. That heat slowly conducted downward, moving through the soil inch by inch, week by week. By the time summer heat reached 4 feet deep, summer was over. The Earth at depth was always experiencing the temperature from months earlier. It was living in the past. In winter, the process reversed. The Earth at depth held heat from the previous summer. Surface cold tried to penetrate downward, but the process was slow. 4 feet down, winter cold would not arrive until spring was already returning to the surface. This thermal lag explained root cellars perfectly. The vegetables were stored in earth that was still warm from summer, protected from winter cold that had not yet reached that depth. By the time deep earth finally cooled, spring was warming the surface again. The Earth's memory created a stable zone that never experienced the extremes of either season. Henrik realized this principle could solve his floor problem. If he could connect his cabin floor to that stable zone 4 feet down, he could eliminate the frozen floor issue entirely. But simply digging down was not enough. He needed to understand how to move heat between the stable Earth zone and his living space above. He dug another test pit, this time inside his cabin near the fireplace. He went down 4 feet and then began experimenting with different materials in the pit. He tried filling it with stones. The stones heated quickly from the nearby fire and held that heat for hours after the fire died. He tried filling it with dirt. The dirt heated slowly but also released heat slowly. He tried filling it with wood. Wood barely heated at all and released what little heat it absorbed almost immediately. Each material had different thermal properties. Henrik began excavating the interior of his cabin on April 3, 1841. The decision seemed insane even to him, but the logic was undeniable. He had a completed cabin with a frozen floor that nearly crippled him. He could build a new cabin with a better floor, or he could fix the existing structure. Building new meant abandoning months of work already invested in this cabin. Fixing meant digging up the entire interior floor and rebuilding it from 4 feet below ground level. Most men would have chosen to build new. Henrik chose to dig. The cabin measured 16 feet by 20 feet internally. That meant 320 square feet of floor to excavate to a depth of 4 feet. Simple mathematics told him he needed to move approximately 470 cubic feet of earth. Each cubic foot of Montana soil weighed roughly 90 pounds. He was looking at over 21 tons of dirt to move by hand using a shovel and buckets. The work would take weeks, possibly months. He started in the corner, farthest from the door, planning to work his way across the cabin systematically. Lars Peterson, Henrik's nearest neighbor 300 yards to the east, visited on the second day of excavation. Lars stood in the doorway and watched Henrik shovel dirt into a bucket, carry it outside, dump it, and return for another load. Lars asked what Henrik was doing. Henrik explained he was improving his floor. Lars asked why he was digging down instead of building up. Henrik tried to explain the thermal mass principle and earth temperature stability. Lars listened politely, then said Henrik was wasting time on foolishness. A dirt floor was a dirt floor. Digging a hole in it would not make winter warmer. Lars left shaking his head. Other neighbors visited over the following weeks as word spread about Henrik's project. Thomas Caldwell, a Scottish trader who passed through the area regularly, stopped to watch. Wilhelm Brenner, a German carpenter who lived 4 miles south, came specifically to see what the crazy Voss brother was doing. Everyone offered the same assessment. Henrik was destroying a functional cabin for no logical reason. Digging down made no sense. If he wanted a better floor, he should lay wooden planks over the dirt like wealthy settlers did. The effort he was investing in excavation could build an entirely new cabin. Henrik listened to the criticism and kept digging. He developed a rhythm: shovel, bucket, carry, dump, return. He worked from dawn until his arms gave out, usually around mid-afternoon. Then he would rest, eat, and sometimes work trap lines to maintain income. The excavation progressed slowly. After 2 weeks, he had completed approximately 1/4 of the cabin floor. After 4 weeks, he was halfway done. His hands developed thick calluses. His back ached constantly, but the hole grew deeper and the pile of excavated earth outside grew larger. Neighbors stopped visiting. They had seen enough. Henrik was committed to his madness. Henrik reached 4 feet depth across the entire cabin floor. On May 19th, the excavation had taken 7 weeks of brutal physical labor. He now stood in a rectangular pit with vertical walls and a level bottom. The cabin walls rose around him, their log bases now 4 feet above where he stood. Looking up at the doorway and window felt strange, as if he had built the cabin in reverse. The space was darker than before. Less natural light reached the bottom of the pit, but the temperature was exactly what he had hoped for. Even though May surface temperatures varied from 40 degrees at night to 70 during sunny afternoons, the temperature at the bottom of his pit stayed locked between 52 and 55 degrees. The excavation created new problems he had not fully anticipated. Water was the most immediate issue. Spring snowmelt raised the water table. On May 22nd, he climbed down into his pit and found 3 inches of standing water covering the bottom. The water had seeped through the earthen walls overnight. If he simply filled the pit with his planned layers of stone and soil, the entire system would become a muddy swamp. He needed drainage. He spent 2 days digging a sump hole in the lowest corner of the pit, going down another 3 feet until he reached gravel layer that drained naturally. He lined the sump with stones to prevent collapse, creating a collection point where water could accumulate and slowly percolate deeper into the earth. Structural stability was the second challenge. The vertical earthen walls of his pit were not permanent. Soil wanted to slump and settle. He needed support posts to carry the weight of the floor layers he planned to build and to maintain the cabin's structural integrity. Henrik designed a post system using principles he had learned from Wilhelm Brenner during previous carpentry conversations. He cut 8 posts from straight pine logs, each post roughly 6 inches square and 8 feet long. He positioned these posts at regular intervals across the pit floor, setting each post base on a flat stone to prevent settling. The posts would support horizontal beams that would in turn support the layered floor system. But Henrik realized the posts themselves needed protection from the soil and moisture surrounding them. Wood in ground contact rotted quickly. He needed to isolate the wood from direct earth contact while still allowing the thermal mass benefits of the surrounding soil. His solution was to wrap the base of each post in birch bark, multiple layers thick, secured with leather strips. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and rot-resistant. It would protect the wood while allowing heat transfer through the thin barrier. He set the posts carefully, checking vertical alignment using a plumb line he made from a stone tied to string. Each post had to be perfectly vertical to properly support the weight above. Once all 8 posts were positioned, he cut and fitted horizontal beams connecting the posts into a rigid framework. The beams were notched where they crossed posts, creating interlocking joints that distributed weight evenly. The framework took 5 days to complete. Henrik began gathering stones in early June. He needed enough rocks to create a continuous layer approximately 8 inches deep, covering the entire 320 square foot floor area. Simple calculation told him he needed roughly 213 cubic feet of stone. River rocks were ideal. They were rounded from water erosion, they packed together efficiently, and they were abundant in the creek that ran half a mile from his cabin. But they were also heavy. Each bucket of stones weighed 40 to 50 pounds. Henrik estimated he would need to make over 200 trips from creek to cabin to gather sufficient material. He developed a collection system to make the work sustainable. Each morning he walked to the creek with 2 buckets and a walking stick. He selected stones between 3 and 8 inches in diameter, avoiding both. Very small rocks that would not hold heat effectively, and very large rocks that were too heavy to carry efficiently. He filled both buckets, carried them back to the cabin, dumped them into the pit, and returned for another load. On good days, he made 8 round trips. On difficult days, when his back or shoulders protested too strongly, he made 4 or 5. The work was mindless and exhausting, but it was also meditative. The rhythm of walking, bending, lifting, and carrying cleared his mind. Thomas Caldwell encountered Henrik on the creek trail during the 2nd week of stone hauling. Thomas was leading a pack mule loaded with furs heading toward the trading post. He stopped and asked Henrik what he was doing with buckets of rocks. Henrik explained his thermal floor project. Thomas had heard about the excavation from other settlers and had dismissed it as foolishness. But seeing Henrik's commitment and hearing the explanation about thermal mass storage made Thomas reconsider. Thomas asked if Henrik understood why stones held heat. Henrik admitted he understood it worked, but not why. Thomas, who had more formal education than most frontier settlers, explained the principle. Stone was dense. Density meant many atoms packed closely together. Heat was the vibration of those atoms. When you heated stone, you were making billions of atoms vibrate faster. Dense material with many atoms could store more vibration energy than light material with fewer atoms. Wood was light and porous. It had relatively few atoms per cubic inch. Stone was heavy and solid. It had many times more atoms in the same space. Therefore, stone could store many times more heat than wood. That heat released slowly as the atoms gradually stopped vibrating. The process could take hours or even days depending on the stone's size and the surrounding temperature. Henrik absorbed this explanation while continuing to load his buckets. The scientific principle matched his observations. Stones nears. His fireplace stayed warm for hours after the fire died. Wood did not. The difference was atomic density and vibration storage. He thanked Thomas for the explanation and continued his work. By late June, he had completed the stone layer. The stone layer now covered the bottom of Henrik's pit, approximately 8 inches deep and remarkably level. He had spent days arranging the rocks to minimize gaps, creating a dense thermal mass that would store and release heat efficiently. But placing wooden floor planks directly on top of stones would create problems. The irregular stone surface would leave air gaps beneath the planks. Those gaps would become nesting places for mice and insects. More importantly, the direct stone-to-wood contact would create condensation issues. Warm, moist air from the cabin would meet the cooler stone surface and form water droplets that would rot the wood within months. Henrik needed a buffer layer between the stone mass and the wooden surface above. He had observed this principle in root cellars. The best root cellars did not store vegetables directly on stone or earth floors. They used intermediate layers that prevented moisture accumulation while still allowing thermal transfer. Anders Olofsson's root cellar had a 6-inch layer of sand between the earth floor and the wooden vegetable bins. The sand absorbed excess moisture and provided drainage while still conducting temperature effectively. Henrik considered using sand, but rejected it. Sand was fine for a root cellar where you wanted cool, stable temperatures. Henrik wanted warm, stable temperatures. He needed a material that would hold some heat itself while preventing moisture problems. His solution was a mixture of earth and organic matter, carefully proportioned to balance thermal mass, drainage, and stability. He started with the soil he had excavated from the pit. This dirt was not random. It came from 4 feet down, where the earth was free of roots and organic debris. It was dense mineral soil with clay content that packed well, but also held moisture. Henrik spread a 2-inch layer of this soil over the stones, filling the gaps between rocks and creating a relatively smooth surface. The soil connected thermally to the stones below, allowing heat to transfer upward while preventing air gaps. Over the soil layer, Henrik added organic material. He had spent the previous weeks gathering dried grasses, plant stems, and moss from the meadow near his cabin. This material was completely dried to prevent rot and decomposition. He chopped it into short pieces, 6 to 8 inches long, and mixed it with additional soil in roughly equal proportions. The mixture created a medium that was part earth and part organic fiber. The organic content prevented the soil from packing into an impermeable clay layer. It maintained small air spaces that provided some insulation while still allowing heat transfer. The earth content provided stability and prevented the organic material from compressing too much under weight. Henrik spread this mixture in a 4-inch layer over the initial soil layer. He packed it down firmly, but not so hard that it became solid. The goal was a stable buffer that would support the layers above while maintaining its thermal and moisture handling properties. The completed buffer zone was now 6 inches deep, spanning from the top of the stone layer to where the wooden deck would eventually rest. This middle layer was critical to the system's success, but it was also the layer that would be invisible and forgotten once construction finished. Henrik now faced the most counterintuitive aspect of his floor system. He had built layers designed to store and conduct heat upward from the thermal mass below. But if heat escaped too quickly from the top surface, the system would drain its stored energy within hours. He needed an insulation layer that would slow heat loss without blocking it entirely. The challenge was finding the right balance. Too little insulation and the floor would cool too fast. Too much insulation and the stored heat would never reach the living surface. The solution required understanding how heat moved through different materials. Heat traveled through solid materials by conduction. Dense solids like stone conducted heat readily. Loose materials with air spaces conducted heat poorly because air itself was an excellent insulator. The best insulation materials were those that trapped air in small pockets while preventing that air from circulating and carrying heat away. Birds understood this principle. Their feathers created thousands of tiny air pockets that kept them warm even in extreme cold. Mammals used fur the same way. Henrik needed a material that mimicked this structure, and the frontier provided exactly what he needed. Dried grass and straw were nature's insulation. The hollow stems trapped air, while the tangled structure prevented circulation. Henrik had seen farmers pack straw around root cellars to prevent freezing. He had seen trappers stuff dried grass into boots for winter warmth. The material worked because it maintained its structure while creating countless small air spaces. Henrik gathered straw from wild grasses that grew near the creek. He cut the grasses in late summer when they were fully dried, bundled them, and stored them in his cabin loft away from moisture. By the time he was ready to install the insulation layer, he had accumulated enough dried grass to cover his entire floor area to whatever depth he chose. The question was depth. Too thin and heat would escape too quickly. Too thick and heat would never reach the surface. Henrik decided to test different depths before committing to the final installation. He created 3 small test sections in one corner of his floor system. One section used 2 inches of compressed straw. The second used 4 inches. The third used 6 inches. Over each test section he laid a thin wooden plank. Then he built a small fire in his fireplace and monitored how quickly heat from the fire transferred through each test section to warm the planks above. The 2-inch section warmed quickly, but also cooled quickly when he extinguished the fire. The plank above the 6-inch section barely warmed at all, even after hours of fire. The 4-inch section provided the balance he sought. The plank warmed noticeably but slowly, taking about 3 hours to reach a comfortable temperature. More importantly, after he extinguished the fire, the plank stayed warm for over 8 hours before beginning to cool significantly. The 4-inch layer allowed enough heat through to warm the surface while providing sufficient insulation to retain that heat for extended periods. Henrik decided on 4 inches as his insulation layer depth throughout the entire floor system. He spread the dried grass evenly over the buffer zone, maintaining consistent 4-inch depth across the 320 square feet. He compressed the grass gently as he worked. The final layer was the wooden deck that would serve as the actual floor surface. This deck needed to be strong enough to support furniture and human weight, smooth enough to walk on comfortably, and designed to allow access to the layers below for maintenance or adjustment. Henrik had watched Wilhelm Brenner build warehouse floors during a visit to the trading post the previous year. Those floors used thick planks laid across supporting joists with small gaps between planks for drainage and air circulation. Henrik adapted this design for his thermal floor system with specific modifications to maximize heat transfer and durability. He started by cutting planks from pine logs he had felled and milled the previous autumn. The logs had seasoned for months, drying slowly to prevent warping and splitting. Each log was quartered lengthwise, then each quarter was carefully hewn into planks roughly 3 inches thick and 12 inches wide. Those thickness provided structural strength and thermal mass. Thick planks would absorb heat from below and hold it longer than thin planks. The width meant fewer planks were needed to cover the floor area, reducing gaps and heat loss. Each plank took hours to produce. Henrik worked with a 2-man saw, anchoring one end of the log and pulling the saw toward himself, then repositioning and repeating. The work was exhausting but essential. He cut the planks to 16-foot lengths, matching the cabin's width. He would lay them perpendicular to the support beams he had installed earlier, creating a deck that distributed weight across the entire framework. Before installing the planks, Henrik treated each one with a mixture of pine tar and linseed oil he had purchased from Dutch Henry's trading post. The treatment sealed the wood, made it water-resistant, and would prevent splinters from developing on the walking surface. He heated the mixture until it was thin enough to brush onto the wood, working it into the grain on all surfaces. The treatment gave the wood a dark amber color and a slight sheen. The plank installation required precision. Henrik laid the first plank against the north wall, checking its position with his plumb line, to ensure it was perfectly perpendicular to the wall. He secured it to the support beams using wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. The pegs allowed the planks to expand and contract with humidity changes without splitting. Metal nails would have been stronger but also more likely to cause splitting and would conduct cold from below. Wooden pegs provided adequate strength while maintaining better thermal properties. He laid the second plank parallel to the first with a quarter-inch gap between them. The gap served multiple purposes. It allowed air circulation to prevent moisture buildup. It accommodated wood expansion during humid periods, and it provided drainage channels if water ever entered the system. Henrik worked systematically across the cabin floor, laying one plank at a time, checking alignment, drilling peg holes, and securing each piece before moving to the next. The work took 3 weeks. By mid-August, the wooden deck was complete except for one crucial feature. Henrik had deliberately made several planks removable by securing them with pegs that could be pulled rather than driven permanently. Henrik completed his floor system on August 23, 1841. The project had consumed 5 months of relentless labor from initial excavation through final plank installation. He stood in his cabin examining the result. The floor looked unremarkable from above. Simple wooden planks, slightly darker than typical frontier flooring due to the pine tar treatment with narrow gaps between boards. Nothing visible suggested the complex 4-layer system hidden beneath. Nothing indicated the tons of stone, the carefully mixed buffer soil, the precisely measured insulation, or the supporting framework that made it all possible. To a casual observer, it was just a wooden floor. But Henrik knew what lay beneath, and he was anxious to see if his engineering would function as designed. The test would come gradually as autumn progressed into winter. He could not rush the process. The thermal mass needed time to charge, storing heat slowly from his daily fires. The stone layer 4 feet below held the memory of summer warmth from the earth surrounding it. Now, Henrik would add fire heat from above, building up thermal energy in the system day by day until winter arrived to test whether that stored heat could sustain comfortable floor temperatures during extended cold. He maintained a modest fire throughout September, even though the weather was still mild. The fire was not for immediate warmth, but for charging the thermal battery beneath his feet. Each evening he burned a small controlled fire for 3 to 4 hours. The heat radiated downward through the wooden deck, through the insulation layer, through the buffer zone, and into the stone mass below. The stones absorbed the energy slowly. He could not feel immediate changes. The floor surface temperature rose only slightly during fire burning, but the stones beneath were accumulating heat in their molecular structure, storing it for future release. By early October, Henrik noticed the first significant change. One morning, he woke to find frost on the cabin's exterior walls, where condensation had frozen overnight. The outside temperature had dropped to 28 degrees. But when he stepped barefoot onto his wooden floor, it felt noticeably warm. Not hot, but distinctly warmer than the cabin's air temperature. He estimated the floor surface was around 55 degrees while the cabin air was perhaps 40 degrees. The thermal mass was beginning to release its stored energy, warming the floor from below, even though no fire had burned for 8 hours. He continued his pattern of evening fires through October and November. The outside temperatures dropped steadily. By late November, nighttime lows reached single digits. The cabin air cooled significantly when fires died, dropping to near freezing by dawn. But the floor maintained temperature in the low 50s. Henrik could walk barefoot comfortably. He could sit on the floor without cold penetrating through his clothing. The system was working, but it had not yet faced a serious test. That test arrived in December. Lars Pedersen visited Henrik's cabin on December 8th with 2 other neighbors, Wilhelm Brenner and Thomas Caldwell. The 3 men had been discussing Henrik's floor project at the trading post. None of them understood why Henrik had invested 5 months in digging up a functional cabin floor and rebuilding it with layers of rocks and grass. The prevailing opinion was that Henrik had wasted tremendous effort for no practical benefit. But they were curious enough to see the result firsthand, and Henrik had invited them to judge for themselves. The men arrived in late afternoon as temperatures dropped toward 20 degrees. Henrik's fire had been out since midday. The cabin was cool, but not uncomfortable. Lars stepped through the door first and immediately noticed the floor. He bent down and placed his palm on the wooden planks. His expression showed surprise. The floor was noticeably warm. Not hot like a surface near a fire, but distinctly warmer than the frigid air surrounding them. Lars asked if Henrik had been running a fire. Henrik showed them the cold fireplace with no recent embers. The fire had been out for over 4 hours. Wilhelm knelt and examined the floorboards more closely. He looked for hidden features, some trick that would explain the warmth. He found nothing unusual visible from above, just wooden planks with small gaps between them. He asked Henrik to explain how it worked. Henrik described the 4-layer system. Stone thermal mass at the bottom storing heat from fire and from earth contact. Buffer layer of soil and organic matter preventing moisture problems and providing transition between stone and insulation. Insulation layer of dried grass, slowing heat release, so the stored energy lasted hours instead of minutes. Wooden deck providing walking surface and additional thermal mass. Thomas remained skeptical. He pointed out that the weather had been relatively mild. December was cold, but not brutally cold. The real test would come in January or February when temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days. Any floor system could maintain some warmth during moderate cold. The question was whether Henrik's elaborate construction could maintain comfort during a genuine Montana deep freeze. Thomas predicted the floor would fail once serious winter arrived. The thermal mass would drain too quickly. The insulation would prove insufficient. Henrik would end up with a frozen floor just like everyone else, but he would have wasted 5 months learning that simple lesson. Henrik did not argue. He simply invited them to return in January to check the floor again. He offered no guarantees or predictions. The system would either work or it would not. Winter would provide the answer. The 3 men left unconvinced. They acknowledged the floor was currently warmer than expected, but they attributed this to residual fire heat or perhaps to the mild weather. None believed the system would survive deep winter. Henrik watched them leave and returned to his evening routine. He built a modest fire, not for immediate warmth, but to continue charging his thermal mass for the challenges ahead. The cold front arrived on January 14, 1842. Henrik woke to air so frigid it hurt to breathe. The moisture in his breath crystallized instantly, creating small ice particles that caught morning light from his window. He climbed out of bed and immediately noticed the cabin's interior temperature had dropped dramatically overnight. His water bucket had a thin layer of ice on top. The walls were covered in frost where humidity had frozen against the cold logs. He estimated the interior temperature was around 15 degrees. Outside would be significantly colder. He stepped onto his wooden floor barefoot. The surface was cool but not painful. He estimated the floor temperature was in the mid-40s. Given that the cabin air was barely above zero, the 40-degree floor felt remarkably warm. He built a fire and prepared coffee while watching the thermometer he had mounted near his door. By mid-morning, the outside temperature registered -18 degrees. The cold was severe and showed no signs of moderating. This was the deep freeze Thomas Caldwell had predicted would defeat his floor system. Henrik maintained a fire throughout the day, but he kept it modest rather than roaring. He wanted to see how the floor performed under genuine stress without artificially inflating the system's performance. Through excessive heating, by evening the outside temperature had dropped to -22 degrees. The cabin air cooled to near zero despite his afternoon fire, but the floor held steady at 42 degrees. He could feel warmth radiating upward through his socks. The thermal mass was releasing stored heat to compensate for the brutal cold, pulling heat away through every cabin surface. The cold continued for 6 days. Each morning brought temperatures between -15 and -25 degrees. Each night dropped even further, bottoming out at -28 on January 19th. Henrik had never experienced cold this severe. Even with continuous modest fires, his cabin air struggled to reach 20 degrees during the warmest part of each day. Water froze solid within minutes if left uncovered. The frost on his walls grew thicker daily. Every surface except his floor was brutally cold, but the floor maintained temperatures between 38 and 45 degrees throughout the entire cold snap. Even on the coldest morning when the cabin interior was 5 degrees below zero, the floor registered 40 degrees. Henrik could stand barefoot for extended periods. He could sit directly on the planks without cold penetrating his clothing. More importantly, the warmth radiating from below provided a baseline heat that made the cabin survivable. Without the floor warmth, the space would have been unbearable even with fire. The floor was not just preventing frozen feet, it was providing meaningful heating to the entire structure. On the 7th day of the historic cold snap, Henrik woke at dawn to find the outside temperature had finally begun rising. The thermometer showed -12 degrees, still brutal, but an improvement from the previous week's extremes. Inside, the cabin air had climbed to 18 degrees overnight without any fire burning since he had gone to sleep. The floor temperature registered 43 degrees. Henrik placed both palms flat on the wooden planks and felt steady warmth radiating upward. The thermal mass had survived the worst cold he had ever experienced and had maintained floor temperatures that would have been impossible with standard construction. He rebuilt his morning fire and sat near the hearth drinking coffee, thinking about what the past week had proven. His floor system had faced temperatures that killed unprepared men. Those same temperatures had defeated standard cabin construction throughout the territory. He knew from conversations at the trading post that other settlers had suffered during the cold snap. Fires had to burn continuously just to keep interior temperatures above zero. Men wore every piece of clothing they owned to bed. Water froze solid in buckets placed near fireplaces, and floors, those standard dirt or wooden floors that everyone used, became so cold they caused pain within seconds of barefoot contact. Henrik's floor had not just survived, it had thrived. The thermal mass stored enough energy during autumn's fire charging to release meaningful heat throughout a week of record cold. The insulation layer had slowed heat loss to the point where the stored energy lasted days rather than hours. The buffer zone had prevented moisture and structural problems while allowing heat transfer. And the wooden deck had provided a warm surface that made the cabin genuinely comfortable despite outside conditions that tested the limits of human survival. The system had exceeded even Henrik's optimistic projections. He spent the day performing normal winter tasks, running trap lines and processing pelts, but his mind kept returning to the floor beneath his feet. He had built something that worked better than anticipated, and he was beginning to understand the broader implications. This was not just a personal solution to a personal problem. This was a replicable technique that could benefit every settler in the territory. Men were losing toes and feet to frozen floors every winter. Some were dying from the accumulated stress of living in inadequately heated spaces. Henrik's floor system could prevent those injuries and deaths. The question was whether other settlers would adopt the technique or dismiss it as too complex and labor-intensive. That question was answered the following evening when someone knocked on his door well after dark. Henrik opened it to find Isaac Drummond standing in the moonlight, shivering violently despite wearing a heavy coat and fur hat. Isaac was a trapper who lived alone about 3 miles east. Henrik had met him occasionally at the trading post, but knew little about him beyond his name and occupation. Isaac's face showed the strain of severe cold exposure. His words came in short gasps between shivers. He asked if he could come inside. Henrik pulled him through the door immediately. Isaac Drummond stumbled into Henrik's cabin and collapsed onto the floor near the door. Henrik grabbed blankets and wrapped them around the shivering man while building up the fire to provide immediate heat. Isaac's hands were white with early frostbite. His feet were in worse condition. When Henrik removed Isaac's boots, he found the man's socks frozen to his skin. The toes were colorless and hard. This was serious frostbite that required immediate intervention. Henrik had experienced minor frostbite the previous year, but Isaac's condition was far more severe. Without proper treatment, Isaac would lose toes at minimum, possibly entire feet. Henrik heated water and began the slow process of rewarming Isaac's extremities. The process had to be gradual. Rapid rewarming could cause more damage than the initial freezing. He soaked cloths in warm water and wrapped them around Isaac's hands and feet, replacing them as they cooled. Isaac groaned in pain as circulation slowly returned. The pain was a good sign. It meant the tissue was alive and responding. Dead tissue felt nothing. Over the next hour, color gradually returned to Isaac's fingers and most of his toes. 2 toes on his left foot remained white and unresponsive. Those would likely be lost, but the rest might be saved. As Isaac's condition stabilized, Henrik learned what had happened. Isaac's cabin had become unlivable during the cold snap. The dirt floor had frozen solid, creating a surface that pulled heat from anything touching it. Despite burning his entire firewood supply trying to keep warm, the cabin's interior temperature never rose above 10 degrees. The frozen floor made sleep impossible. Isaac had wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and still suffered hypothermia symptoms after just a few hours lying down. By the 4th day of severe cold, he had run out of firewood and options. He had spent that afternoon walking through brutal cold to reach Henrik's cabin, knowing it was his only chance for survival. Isaac had heard stories about Henrik's floor project from other trappers. The stories had been mostly mocking, painting Henrik as someone who wasted months on foolish experiments. But desperation had made Isaac willing to test whether those stories were wrong. Now sitting in Henrik's cabin with feeling slowly returning to his frozen extremities, Isaac understood the stories had been completely wrong. He placed his hand on the wooden floor and felt warmth that seemed impossible given the conditions outside. He asked how the floor could be warm when his entire cabin had been colder than a root cellar. Henrik explained the thermal mass system while continuing to treat Isaac's frostbite. Isaac listened with the intensity of a man learning information that had just saved his life. He asked detailed questions about the stone layer, the insulation depth, the buffer zone composition. Henrik answered each question patiently, describing the construction process and the principles behind each design decision. Isaac asked if the system was difficult to build. Henrik admitted it had taken 5 months of hard labor. Isaac asked if it was worth the effort. Henrik gestured at Isaac's frostbitten feet and the warm floor beneath them. Isaac nodded slowly. Worth the effort was an understatement. Isaac Drummond stayed in Henrik's cabin for 3 days while his frostbite healed and the weather moderated. During those 3 days, he experienced the thermal floor system's benefits continuously. He woke each morning to a warm surface beneath him even when the fire had died overnight. He walked barefoot comfortably while outside temperatures remained below 0. He felt heat radiating upward from the floor, providing baseline warmth that made the entire cabin more comfortable. By the time he was healthy enough to leave, Isaac had become an absolute convert to Henrik's construction method. He asked if Henrik would help him build a similar system in his own cabin. Henrik agreed, and in late February, after the worst cold had passed but before spring work demanded attention, the 2 men began excavating Isaac's cabin floor. The work went faster with 2 people. What had taken Henrik 7 weeks of solo digging took them 4 weeks working together. Isaac was motivated by recent suffering in a way that made the labor feel purposeful rather than tedious. Every bucket of dirt removed was one step closer to never experiencing frozen feet again. They completed the excavation, installed the stone layer using rocks from the same creek Henrik had used, added the buffer and insulation layers following Henrik's specifications, and finished with a wooden deck by mid-April. Word of Isaac's floor project spread through the scattered trapping and settling community. Other men who had suffered during the January cold snap began asking questions. Lars Pedersen, who had mocked Henrik's floor the previous autumn, visited in early May and asked if Henrik would help him build a similar system. Wilhelm Brenner, who had been skeptical about the engineering, came by to examine the floor closely and admitted he had been wrong to doubt its effectiveness. Thomas Caldwell, who had predicted failure, stopped by to apologize and ask for construction guidance. Henrik shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked. He provided detailed explanations of layer depths, material selections, and construction techniques. He helped several neighbors with their excavations and stone installations. By the summer of 1842, 8 cabins in the surrounding area were undergoing thermal floor installations. Some followed Henrik's design exactly. Others modified details based on available materials or specific site conditions. One settler named James Morrison built his system using slate instead of river rocks because slate was abundant near his cabin. Another settler, Carl Jensen, used wool instead of dried grass for insulation because he raised sheep and had excess wool fiber available. The variations worked because the underlying principles remained consistent. Thermal, mass storage, insulating layer to slow heat release, buffer zone to manage moisture, and structural deck to provide usable surface. The specific materials mattered less than understanding the function of each layer. The transformation was remarkable. Men who had mocked Henrik's 5-month project were now investing similar time and effort in their own floors. The winter of 1842 to 1843 provided definitive proof of the thermal floor's effectiveness across multiple installations. Every cabin that had adopted Henrik's system maintained comfortable floor temperatures throughout the season. Men who had previously dreaded winter now slept soundly on warm surfaces. Frostbite cases dropped dramatically in the area. Dutch Henry at the trading post noted the change in his informal medical log. The previous winter, he had treated 11 cases of serious frostbite requiring amputation or extended care. The winter after thermal floor adoption, he treated only 2 cases, both involving men who had not modified their cabin floors. The technique acquired a name through common usage. Settlers initially called it the Voss floor, after Henrik's family name. Trappers referred to it as the warm floor or the layered floor. By 1844, the most common term was simply thermal floor, a name that captured the essential function without crediting any individual. Henrik preferred this anonymous naming. He had never sought recognition. He had solved a problem that nearly crippled him, and he had shared that solution because helping others survive seemed like basic human decency. The frontier was harsh enough without keeping survival knowledge secret. The technique spread beyond Henrik's immediate area through the natural movement of trappers and traders. Thomas Caldwell, who traveled extensively buying furs and selling supplies, described the thermal floor system to settlers throughout the northern Rockies. Men building new cabins began incorporating the system from initial construction rather than retrofitting existing structures. This approach was more efficient than Henrik's original excavation retrofit. A new cabin could be built with the floor pit already planned, eliminating the need to dig out a completed structure. Construction time for a thermal floor cabin was approximately 6 weeks, compared to 4 days for a standard cabin. Most settlers considered the extra time worthwhile given the comfort and safety benefits. By 1846, thermal floors had become standard construction in several territories. Military surveyors documenting frontier settlements noted the prevalence of advanced floor systems utilizing thermal mass principles in their reports. These reports reached Eastern architects and builders who began incorporating similar techniques in root cellars, spring houses, and other structures requiring temperature stability. The principle of using earth coupling and thermal mass for temperature regulation was not new to engineering, but Henrik's specific application to frontier cabin construction introduced the concept to a population that had previously relied on simple and often inadequate building methods. The technique continued evolving as more builders experimented with variations. Some used brick instead of stone for thermal mass. Others tried different insulation materials, including pine needles, cattail down, or even bear fur. One innovative builder created a system using clay tiles that could be removed and heated directly in the fireplace before being returned to the floor system for rapid heat injection. These variations proved that the underlying principle was sound and adaptable. The specific implementation details could change based on materials, climate, and builder skill, but the core concept of thermal mass storage with insulated release remained effective. Henrik Voss married Anna Lindström in the spring of 1847. Anna was the daughter of a Swedish farming family who had settled in the Oregon Territory. Henrik had left the Montana mountains in 1845 after beaver populations collapsed and the fur trade died. He used savings from his trapping years to purchase 40 acres of farmable land near Salem. The land was fertile, the climate was mild compared to Montana winters, and the community was established enough to provide markets for crops and livestock. It was a different life from the isolation and hardship of mountain trapping, but Henrik was ready for the change. He built a house on his Oregon land using conventional construction. The climate did not require thermal floor systems. Winter temperatures rarely dropped below freezing. The engineering challenge that had consumed a year of his Montana life was irrelevant in this gentler environment. But Henrik still built carefully and thoughtfully. His house had proper foundations, tight joinery, and quality materials. The habits of precise construction remained even when the extreme demands were absent. Anna appreciated the solid house and the man who had built it with such care. They raised 4 children in that house over the next 2 decades. Henrik rarely spoke about his Montana years. His children knew their father had been a trapper and had lived in the mountains, but they knew few specific details. The story of the thermal floor was not something Henrik emphasized. It had been a practical solution to a survival problem, not an achievement he felt warranted storytelling. When visitors asked about his past, Henrik would mention trapping beaver and enduring hard winters, but he deflected attention from his own innovations. The floor had worked. Other men had adopted it. That was sufficient. Henrik died on March 8, 1871, at age 62 from pneumonia that developed after a late winter cold. He was buried in the Salem Pioneer Cemetery under a simple headstone that listed his name, birth year, and death year. The stone made no mention of Montana, thermal floors, or the technique that had spread across the frontier and saved dozens of men from frostbite and death. His family mourned him as a good husband, father, and farmer. They inherited the solid house he had built and the productive farm he had established. His legacy to them was stability and care. But in the mountains of Montana, Wyoming, and the northern Rockies, a different legacy persisted. Cabins built with thermal floor systems continued functioning decades after their construction. Some remained occupied by new generations of settlers. Others stood abandoned as the frontier era ended and populations shifted to towns and cities. But even abandoned, those cabins demonstrated their superior construction. While standard cabins collapsed within years of abandonment, thermal floor cabins remained structurally sound. The careful engineering that Henrik had developed to solve one specific problem had created buildings that outlasted their era and their builder. His name was forgotten, but his work remained silent and functional, keeping floors warm and feet safe, long after the man who made it possible had returned to the earth he had understood so well.